Good evening and welcome to the Newshour Agenda. I'm Madhavdas GK. Viewers, after the bloodbath yesterday, the Indian stock markets have got a breather today. But is it some lull before a full-fledged storm? Well, we are seeing a lot of tit-for-tat tariffs, particularly between China and the United States. Sample this. In February, we saw US imposing a 10% tariff on China. China hit back with countermeasures at that point of time. And later, when it came to in March, we saw Trump, in fact, doubling the tariff to 20% for China. China retaliated with a 15% tariff at that point of time. In April, Trump announced a 54% tariff for China, and China retaliated with a 34% tariff for the United States. Trump has further threatened an additional 50%, and China has now vowed a fight to the end as far as tariffs are concerned. Listen in.
Meat and other countries are coming in. With China, as you know, against my statement, they put a 34% tariff on above what their ridiculous tariffs were already. And I said, if that tariff isn't removed by tomorrow at 12 o'clock, we're putting a 50% tariff on above the tariffs that we put on. So they've gone for years. They've become a rich country because of people, again, that were in the White House that allowed this to happen. Hundreds of billions of dollars a year they'd make on us on trade, and it shouldn't be that way. And I have a great relationship with President Xi. I hope it's going to stay that way. I have great respect for China, but they can't do this. We're going to have one shot at this, and no other president's going to do this, what I'm doing. And I'll tell you what, it's an honor to do it because we have been just destroyed. What they've done to our system. You know, we have $36 trillion of debt for a reason.
Now, as per reports coming in, Elon Musk made personal appeals to Donald Trump. The Doge chief attempted intervention after Trump threatened on Monday to impose additional 50% tariff on imports from China. Musk even held direct private talks with the president, as per reports, hoping to convince him to scale back the measures, but it hasn't brought success so far. So is the world staring at the beginning of what could be a lengthy global trade war?
You're watching the News Hour at 10, debate number 1 on Times Now, Super Prime Time.
And joining us for more on this, we have Thomas J. Phillipson, who's a former acting chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Trump administration. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us here on Times Now. Now, there are recent reports which suggest there are growing differences between Elon Musk and President Trump over the tariff issue. How do you view this development, and do you think that Trump is now beginning to face increasing pressure from within his own circle?
No, I don't think it's a disagreement growing. I think everyone is on board in the White House of the reciprocity of tariffs, meaning U.S. has been treated worse abroad than we treat companies coming into the U.S. And a big push for reciprocity came out April 2nd, obviously. That's not the only thing that came out. It was more than that. But with reciprocity, Elon Musk and other people, and myself for the last 2 months, essentially have pointed out that with reciprocity, we can have free trade if countries are willing to go down in their tariffs, essentially, and we match that. That's a force towards free trade. And there's a lot of incentives for countries to do that now. About 50 of them have already contacted the U.S. Trade Representative and want to negotiate their barriers for U.S. companies abroad. So that's a force that's actually operating in the direction of free trade currently. We'll see how that continues the next month or 2 or 3.
Right. No, because there's an increasing perception that, while Trump himself is, full of conviction that what he's doing is the right path for the United States, the fact is that he's also a businessman, and therefore the question that whether he can act against what is perceived to be Wall Street's interest for a very long time.
Well, I think when you change this imbalance, which I think the world really agrees with, that U.S. gets treated worse abroad than we treat companies at home, when you try to change that imbalance, which this is an effort to do, there will be, by definition, a lot of uncertainty what that change looks like. And we don't know yet what that change looks like. Markets always react poorly to great uncertainty, particularly in trade barriers if there's international revenues of companies. But that's a necessary evil, essentially, of having this uncertainty in order to have this change. And I think that markets are now recovering a little bit in the U.S. today, also worldwide. So I think that initial shock is more about what is this going to lead to. If it does lead to the beneficial arrangement that countries are now dropping trade barriers on the U.S., both tariff and non-tariff, then there will be a much larger rebound later on if that's the outcome. If it escalates into a trade war, that's obviously the opposite effect.
Now, India's approach appears to be more a diplomatic one because India has prioritized trade deal negotiations over any kind of retaliation against Trump's tariffs. Given your expertise, how do you see this strategy paying out as far as Indian exporters are concerned?
No, I think India was very quick out of the block with Israel and Switzerland and Vietnam, essentially. You were one of the first who started, starting to negotiate. I think that's going to be very beneficial for India in terms of the administration is going to be very friendly towards early negotiators. But we hope that you are a trendsetter as opposed to just a few people in the beginning of what's going to come down the pipe, which is let's reduce trade barriers on both sides and have more free trade.
Right. And you've earlier highlighted the growing deficit in America's biopharmaceutical sector. Now, considering that India is a major exporter of affordable medicines to the U.S., don't you think imposing tariffs could restrict these imports and end up hurting the U.S. and U.S. citizens itself?
Well, India is a major exporter of generic medicines, meaning off-patent medicines. They're not such a big exporter of brand name medicine, meaning medicines that are still on patent, essentially. It is a big concern that was highlighted during COVID that both administrations, Democratic and Republicans, viewed COVID as an extreme illustration of how vulnerable we can be in a medical emergency. So both administrations are very much in line in pushing for medical supply chains coming into the U.S. of necessary medicines. That was a big revelation during COVID when there was such problems with medical supply chains, not only overall supply chains. So I think that's an issue that India has to watch. How much I expect the Trump administration to move more aggressively on that than the Biden administration did. But it's something for India to clearly try to accommodate in one way or another that benefits them.
All right. Thomas Phillipson, thank you so much for taking the time out and speaking to us here in Times Now. Let's now take it across to our other guests. Joining us with us is Raymond D. Vickery, who's a senior associate at CSIS. We also have Ina Tangent, chairman of Asia Narratives. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Raymond Vickery, what are we looking at? Are we looking at a long-drawn trade war with China? There are those who are calling it an economic nuclear war.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I think you have to step back. We have had since World War II an international trading system that was first the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and then the WTO. And that was based upon a consensus approach, most favored nation. And what the Trump administration is doing and what President Trump is doing is completely tearing that system apart in favor of going back to an earlier 20th century or even late 19th century system of bilateral agreements. I don't think that this is in the interest of the world. It's not an interest of the United States or India. If you look at it as you need to have enlightened self-interest, which means you're not just trying to do a deal like in real estate, but you're trying to put together a system which works to build peace and prosperity throughout the world. So that having been said, what has happened here is a destruction of that system and a kickoff of international trade wars. Now, it is hoped, as your previous guest said, that there may be some moving towards zero tariffs on both sides. That would be an ideal outcome. But that really isn't the heart of what President Trump has in mind here. What he has in mind is a recreation of the manufacturing base in the United States, which existed in the 1950s. The world has moved on since the 1950s. Services are very much a part of the international economy.
Right.
And this approach of just looking at what trade deficit.
Stay with us, Mr. Vikri. Stay with us. A very important point that you've said. The world's moved on since the 50s, but in a tangent, China says that it will fight to the end in response to what President Trump has announced in terms of tariffs. And, you know, with the tariffs now crossing about 100% as well, you know, are we looking at an all-out trade war that China and the U.S. are going to be engaging in?
Oh, not at all. I mean, Trump is bluffing. I used to run elections in the United States, and I can tell you, as we speak, it's not only the demonstrations that you see, but congressmen and senators are getting calls, and they're being told quite bluntly, if you don't control costs, I'm not going to vote for you. Congressmen and senators are very keen on being re-elected. So you're going to start to see a sea change here, and Donald Trump increasingly getting pressure. This has all been a bluff since the beginning. I mean, taxing penguins is not going to help the United States. And quite frankly, this is just shock and awe. He wanted to see if he announced all these things, whether people would fold, whether there's an opportunity for a deal. Classic Trump tactics.
Okay, these are classic Trump tactics, Mr. Vikri says, Mr. Ina Tangent. But, you know, as per Washington Post reports, apparently Elon Musk is the latest to put pressure on President Trump as far as these tariffs are concerned. And we all know what outsourcing from China means as far as Elon Musk is concerned. That could send his entire business model into a tizzy.
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope that this is a bluff and just part of negotiating techniques, but the harm is already being done, and the harm is going to affect the United States regardless of the outcome, because you are seeing an increase in inflation, which is what got Trump elected in part in the first place. Now, Elon Musk is a fellow who is involved in international trade. He knows that this approach is ridiculous. It's not reciprocal. It's based just upon some sort of mercantilist theory that if you have a trade surplus, you've made money, but if you have a deficit, you've lost money. But of course, that's not the case at all. Macroeconomics is involved in terms of the savings rate, and there are many factors. And he has interest in China, as many American companies do. So, you know, it is true that China has been an abuser of the system. They've had subsidies where they were not allowed under the WTO. They've had non-tariff barriers, and they need to clean up their act. But the way in which you should go about it is going directly at those kinds of abuses rather than trying to bring down the whole system under some cockamamie theory that basically you'll return the United States to sort of a fortress America economy, and that's going to benefit the working man and woman here. It's just not going to happen. It's not going to benefit India either.
All right. And in attention, you know, how does China interpret Trump's statement? On the 7th of April, he said, and I'm quoting, "China wants to make a deal badly, but doesn't know how to start." Is this a genuine negotiation signal, or is this just something that's going to further, just ensure that the markets further crash?
Well, yeah, no, I mean, Donald Trump is looking for a way out. He started talking about TikTok. China shut him down. It's not the case. But I want to answer a point that was raised by my colleague here, this idea that China is abused. The fact is the U.S. has lost its competitive edge. And now all of a sudden it's somebody else's fault that China's ahead in 57 out of 63 different high technology things. That doesn't come through copying anybody else or anything like that. This is just a narrative that's pushed by Washington because of the failure of the political system to bring about the kind of changes necessary. Donald Trump, we can say that he's an outlier, but the fact is he's been elected twice. And this means that both he and the United States are unreliable at this point in the eyes of the rest of the world. Remember, this is not a U.S.-China issue. Donald Trump attacked 180 nations. He's torn apart the fabric of the international trade at a time when developing nations for the last 20 years have been slowly gaining on the
there's a slight
nations.
difference. You're absolutely right that he started off these tariffs for over 180 nations, but the point is, when it comes to China is where the tariffs have crossed 104% with the additional 50% tariff. He's not relenting with China.
Pushed back.
There's no negotiation happening there. Other countries, India and others, are at least on the negotiating table. That's not happening in the case of China. Why is that?
So you believe that if a bully comes up and slaps you, that you should get down on your knees and thank them. The fact is, China is the only nation that can stand up to Donald Trump. He's a playground bully. He's literally going to 180 nations and saying, give me your lunch money or I'll beat you up. All right?
Do you agree with that analogy,
I wouldn't
Raymond
be
Vickery?
proud of saying that I'm acquiescing to that.
Raymond Vickery, you agree with that analogy?
Well,
Yes,
listen,
that is
it is true that Donald Trump has acted outside the law domestically and internationally, and he is a bully. But that does not justify the kinds of abuses that China has made in regard to the international system. For a spokesperson for China to say, look, there's no
I'm an American.
getting intellectual property or there's no abuse. And what has to happen is that the nations of the world have to get together and get back to a rule of law in regard to trade, just as in security matters. And China has a role to play in that, but China is not all on the good side, and anybody from the U.S. all on the bad side. This is a difficult situation, and it requires across-the-board diplomacy.
All right. Raymond Vickery, in our tangent, I'd like to thank both of you for joining us with your perspectives. And certainly the whole world is watching what happens as far as US, China, and particularly as far as the issue of tariffs is concerned, because the implications are global when it comes to this particular case. Thanks so much for joining us this evening.